Breaking news today. Even with talks between Erdogan and Putin on a grain deal, expectations are low. Concerns have been raised by various parties because the fate of the grain deal is still up in the air. According to Sputnik, an insider's assessment of the situation indicates that extending the grain deal past its current deadline of July 17 is unlikely. The only possible silver lining is the upcoming meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. President Erdogan has stated his intention to speak with President Putin about the grain deal following his discussions with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky last Friday. He also mentioned that he expects President Putin to visit him in the next month, further emphasizing the pressing nature of the situation. On Saturday, however, Sputnik spoke with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who said that Putin and Erdogan's phone call had not yet been scheduled. The fate of the Black Sea Grain Initiative is even more in doubt now. The extension of the agreement was announced by Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on May 17. In the event that all implementation-related concerns were resolved, Russia was willing to extend the Black Sea Grain Agreement. On July 22, 2022, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey signed an agreement facilitated by the United Nations to create a humanitarian maritime corridor from Ukrainian Black Sea ports for the transport of food and fertilizer. The war in Ukraine and Western sanctions against Russia triggered a global food crisis, but the agreement to export grain has helped alleviate that crisis. The United Nations estimates that by the end of March, over 24.1 million tons of grain will have been exported as a result of the agreement. Contrary to popular belief, only 25% of BSGI grain exports are actually going to low-income countries, as reported by the FAO in October 2022. I do not mean to make light of the tragedy that has befallen the people of Ukraine and Russia since February 22 by referring to the war as strange. To the contrary, however, the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine leaves many questions unanswered. In addition, the Wagner mercenary group's ongoing mutiny drama has added a new dimension, with even more peculiar consequences. Let's take a look at how this war got started. Since World War II's conclusion, NATO's advancement toward Russia's western border has been steady but steady. The countries of the former Warsaw Pact, such as Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, joined NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. In 2004, the alliance saw its greatest growth when 7 new members joined: Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In 2009, for example, the 6th expansion, Albania and Croatia joined. Montenegro joined as the 7th member in 2017. North Macedonia joined the Group of 8 in 2020. Finnish membership in NATO began in that year. Sweden, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Ukraine, etc. are just some of the countries that have publicly stated their interest in joining NATO. All these countries are pushing and shoving to join NATO, not because they adore NATO, but because they are afraid of being sucked into Russia's maw. These newly formed European nations need this alliance to keep Russia at bay, at least temporarily, after the Soviet Union's collapse. This is a foregone conclusion, given the vast distance between China and any potential monsters. Since the United States must keep most of Europe within its sphere of influence, realpolitik requires it to consider keeping the Russian bogey alive through controlled economic sanctions and military activities. If Russia is no longer a threat, the United States will be like a hammer without a nail. Russia did nothing to stop NATO's expansion. When asked if Russia had ever voiced opposition to NATO expansion, Bing replied, "Yes, Russia has raised objections against NATO expansion." Russia's concerns about NATO expanding eastward were well known. Many factors have contributed to the current standoff between Russia and the West, but the greatest is Moscow's perception that it was betrayed by the West following the collapse of the Soviet Union. That Ukraine was too close to home and heart for Russia to ignore is a safe inference even robots have made. That's the origin story of the war. This was not a conflict between equals. One side was an aggressive superpower, backed by vast military power, while the other side defended its territory through sheer force of will and superior strategy. After failing to prepare for Russia's response to its alliance expansion, the West has stepped in with hardware, intelligence, and promises, sparking a contest that has already lasted for over a year. No one, not even the shadowy deep state, knows whether the West's apparent ignorance of the probable Russian reaction to its expansion program was deliberate or pure stupidity. The combatants on both sides determine the war's direction. In this case, no. Surprisingly, neither side has gone all out in this conflict. The Russians no longer appear interested in taking Kiev, and are instead content to rule territory to the east of the Dnieper River and in Crimea. But Ukraine hasn't made any moves to expand the conflict into Russian territory or open a second front in an attempt to pull Russian troops away from the east. Russia has not used its air or naval forces against Ukraine's critical infrastructure. While from Ukraine's perspective this is somewhat understandable given their reliance on supporter-supplied hardware, from Russia's it is completely incomprehensible, save for the possibility that poor planning and execution on the part of the Russian General Staff is to blame. They appear content to fire hypersonic missiles at civilian structures. While the Indian Army was busy navigating the difficult riverine terrain of East Pakistan during the 1971 Bangladesh War, the IAF attacked targets deep within Pakistan, including the capital city of Dhaka, and blasted the port of Karachi from the sea, thousands of miles away from the front lines. It's also hard to fathom that a country would give its enemies 6 months' notice of a counterattack, giving them plenty of time to prepare. The United States has recently made the difficult decision to supply cluster ammunition, a banned item, to the Ukrainians due to a lack of 155 mm ammunition, all because of the Russians' tenacious defenses. Not only is it impossible to keep up with the demand for artillery ammunition in an offensive war, but the same is true for tanks like the Bradleys and Leopards. It also comes as a huge surprise that these logistical givens weren't taken into account earlier. This war is very unusual. If the war was unusual, the mutiny by the Russian army's mercenary force was beyond bizarre. Russia's notorious underground military has served as a crucial cog in Russian foreign policy and a lucrative cash cow for the Kremlin. It allowed the Wagner Group's CEO to publicly criticize and insult the defense minister and the chief of armed forces for months, in a country where dissent is not tolerated at all by the government. And if that were strange enough, the state's side never responded to the public insinuations. There was obviously a war within the war, and that never bodes well for a nation's overall war effort. The so-called mutiny and the widely reported march on Moscow were both bizarre outcomes of the internal conflict. It's a huge mystery how the mutineers were able to make it 400 or so kilometers to the nation's capital unimpeded, through national highways in broad daylight. I read volumes of speculation, but no one seems to know for sure what motivated the mutiny's beginning or its midway suppression. The leader of the Wagner Group has gone missing between Minsk and Moscow, and it is unclear what became of the 50,000 or so troops under his command. This is the only absolute truth. Powerful people inside and outside of Russia are undoubtedly trying to capitalize on the fact that the myth of Putin's infallibility has been shattered as a result of this baffling episode. In any case, talk abounds about the fate of the Russian Federation after Putin's departure. Some people believe that a cornered and scared Putin is more dangerous than a strong one, while others insist that this is the moment of greatest opportunity. Concerns about how to get rid of Russia's massive nuclear stockpile have replaced ideas of breaking up the country into smaller units. Mr. Lukashenko of Belarus, the hero of the counter-mutiny, has done nothing but put his country's assets on NATO's hit list by hosting Russia's nuclear arsenal. Aside from the manpower, the aggressors are being driven out of their country by outsourcing everything else necessary for a war effort, including possibly the tactics. Despite having enough resources, the other side is getting lost in a misadventure they got themselves into because someone wanted to be the next Tsar of Ukraine, and they are a long way from their original goal of bringing about a regime change in Kiev. One thing that is certain is that neither side will achieve their goals entirely.